Hey guys, tonight we're starting with humanity's oldest companion, and arguably its worst decision, alcohol. From the sacred halls of ancient temples to the rowdy medieval taverns, we have been finding new and inventive ways to ruin our mornings ever since civilization first began. So, before you settle in, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy the stories I tell here. And I'd love it if you let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always amazed to see who is joining us from all corners of the globe. Now, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's slowly ease into tonight's journey together. Long before civilization, before the written word, before anyone had figured out how to boil water without setting the hut on fire, someone stumbled upon the invention of getting drunk. This momentous event happened around 7000 BCE in Neolithic China, when a farmer left a pot filled with rice, honey, and fruit just sitting around for a little too long. The mixture did what all neglected things eventually do. It fermented, creating a strange, bubbling potion that smelled equally of curiosity and future regret. At some point, a person who was possibly hungry, maybe a little stupid, but was definitely bored, made the fateful decision to drink it. That very moment right there was the true dawn of human history. It wasn't the invention of the wheel, nor was it the discovery of fire, but the instant someone stared at a suspicious jar of spoiled fruit and thought to themselves, "Yeah, I'll give that a shot." The first sip was likely confusing. The second probably felt incredible. By the third sip, our prehistoric protagonist was likely trying to explain his feelings to a nearby goat. The world started to spin. The trees began to look deeply philosophical, and suddenly everyone around him seemed like a truly fantastic dancer. It must have felt like he was touching the divine, which is probably what he told all of his friends right before collapsing into a heap of mud. So congratulations, humanity. You've just discovered alcohol. And about 5 hours later, you also discovered the concept of consequences. Archaeologists later uncovered 9,000-year-old pottery jars at the Jiahu archaeological site, still stained with the faint traces of that ancient brew, a concoction of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. It stands as the earliest known cocktail, the prehistoric version of just mixing together whatever you can find in the fridge. Chemical analysis later confirmed that it was, in fact, fermented, which means this was no longer just a happy accident. It was the start of a tradition. Someone had gotten drunk, managed to survive the experience, and then made the conscious choice to do it all over again, but on purpose this time. And with that, the world's very first hangover officially arrived. The following morning, our ancient innovator probably woke up in a puddle of his own decisions, feeling dehydrated, dizzy, and simultaneously inventing the first known excuse, which was likely, "It must have been something I ate." This wasn't just a simple drink. It was humanity's first real coping mechanism, a portable escape from reality, created long before there were jobs, taxes, or annoying neighbors to blame for your problems. So yes, while the great civilizations that followed would go on to build pyramids, write legal codes, and split the atom, this is where it all truly started. It began with one forgotten jar, one questionable decision, and one species coming to the realization that sometimes oblivion can taste pretty darn good. If you ever find yourself needing proof that humans have always had their priorities a bit backward, you don't have to look any further than Mesopotamia. Around 4000 BCE, while the rest of the natural world was busy evolving for survival, humanity was inventing beer. It was only after that they thought, what might actually go well with this? Food. Yes, you heard that right. Beer came into existence before bread. People were already brewing barley long before they had any idea how to bake it into a loaf. Archaeologists have discovered ancient tablets that show Sumerians joyfully drinking from massive communal pots using long straws, because apparently, even back then, nobody wanted to share germs. And these were not small cups we're talking about. Just try to picture a group of adults all hunched over something that looks like a muddy punch bowl, sipping away in silence and trying to pretend it's a deeply spiritual experience. That, right there, was civilization's first happy hour. The Sumerians didn't just drink beer either. They constructed an entire belief system around it. They had a goddess of brewing named Ninkasi, because of course they did. Her hymn, and yes, there is a hymn, also serves as a recipe for brewing beer. It is quite possibly the oldest surviving homebrew guide on the entire planet. Modern civilization, it turns out, began not with deep philosophy, but with a slightly tipsy choir singing praises to a divine bartender. Beer was not considered a luxury. It was a part of the essential infrastructure. Water in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't exactly what you would call safe. Drinking it was more like a gamble with your health. But beer, having been brewed and fermented, was purified by the boiling process and its alcohol content. In other words, drinking beer wasn't an irresponsible choice at all. It was actually the healthiest option available to them. Imagine trying to explain that one to your doctor today. Daily rations of beer were provided for everyone, including workers, priests, and even children. And this wasn't the fizzy, golden liquid that we're familiar with now. It was a thick, sweet beverage, and it was full of floating bits of barley. Archaeologists have described it as being nutrient-rich. In modern terms, that translates to drinkable oatmeal that gives you a buzz. And yet somehow, this murky concoction fueled the world's first great cities. People farmed the land, they built towering temples, and they wrote on cuneiform tablets, all while maintaining a steady, mild state of intoxication. This might explain why about half of the early Sumerian laws sound like they were written right around closing time. So yes, beer truly did build civilization. It wasn't logic, it wasn't language, and it wasn't ambition. It was just a group of dehydrated farmers solving the world's problems one foamy bowl at a time. If Mesopotamia was the civilization that invented beer, then Egypt was the one that turned it into a lifestyle. By 3000 BCE, the Nile Valley had completely mastered the art of getting a little tipsy before lunchtime. Beer wasn't just a treat for them. It was a part of their daily nutrition. It made an appearance at breakfast, during prayers, as payment for wages, and even at funerals. Technically, you could live your entire life fueled by nothing more than bread, onions, and beer, which probably explains why most ancient Egyptians looked both incredibly busy and perpetually exhausted. For the common folk, beer was cheap and thick, more like a liquid porridge than what we would consider a drink. It was brewed using barley and emmer wheat, sweetened up with some dates, and then poured into clay jugs that probably hadn't been properly cleaned since the last pharaoh was in charge. Still, it was a much safer bet than drinking water from the Nile, which usually came with a bonus helping of parasites. The average peasant drank about 2 to 3 liters of it every single day, which means that half of Egyptian civilization was constructed by people who were quietly buzzed all the time. Even the children drank it. This wasn't because ancient Egypt was some kind of wild place, but because sober hydration simply wasn't a viable option. When the water is guaranteed to give you dysentery, having beer for breakfast starts to sound like a perfectly logical idea. Parents would fill up clay cups for their kids and send them on their way to school as if it were a glass of orange juice. And then we wonder why mathematics was invented somewhere else. The upper class, on the other hand, had a preference for wine, which was the official beverage for people who didn't have to do any manual labor. Pharaohs would import it from places like Syria and Greece, store it in beautifully ornate jars, and pretend that it was a symbol of their refinement rather than just some grape juice that had gone rogue. Cleopatra herself was said to have had her own private vineyard, because apparently, ruling over Egypt required a combination of charm and a good Cabernet. Temples brewed beer on an industrial scale. The workers who built the Great Pyramids were paid in daily rations of bread and beer, which means that the most iconic monument on Earth was fueled by a mix of carbohydrates and mild inebriation. The afterlife even came fully stocked with it. Tomb paintings depict servants pouring beer for the deceased, ensuring they would have eternal refreshment and presumably eternal hovers. So, while Egypt gave us things like papyrus, geometry, and the concept of divine kingship, it also gave us something a bit more relatable. It gave us the eternal truth that life is just a little bit easier to get through when everything is slightly blurry around the edges. While the Egyptians were busy drinking their bread soup and calling it beer, the Chinese were engaged in something far more sophisticated, or at least they were pretending to be. Around 3000 BCE, early brewers in the Yellow River Valley started fermenting rice, millet, and various fruits into beverages that actually tasted like they were made on purpose. Archaeologists have discovered ornate bronze vessels that are coated in a residue that once held this early Chinese wine, providing more proof that humanity's talent for turning dinner into liquid regret was now a worldwide phenomenon. Unlike other cultures that just sort of stumbled their way into intoxication, the Chinese actually organized it. Fermentation wasn't just a happy accident for them. It was chemistry that had religious backing. Alcohol was viewed as a precious gift from the heavens, a kind of bridge that connected mortal humans with their ancestors. This sounds quite poetic until you remember that this bridge usually ended with someone singing terribly off-key before passing out in the middle of a rice field. Drinking became a central part of ritual life. Kings and nobles would host these elaborate ceremonies where wine was offered up to the spirits, and then, almost immediately, to themselves, just to make sure that it was safe for consumption. Ancient texts even mention officials who lost their jobs because they were too sober at court banquets. In other words, not drinking wasn't just uncool, It was a politically risky move. The Chinese didn't just brew their alcohol casually, they engineered it. They refined the vessels used for fermentation, they standardized their recipes, and they even documented the proper etiquette for drinking alcohol. By the time of the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, life at court was basically one long, well-funded tasting session. There were official drinking songs, drinking cups that were shaped like animals, and, inevitably, the very first government warnings about drinking in excess. Because even the world's most ancient bureaucracy came to realize that productivity tends to plummet when half of your ministers are horizontal. Still, alcohol was seen as something sacred, the water of life, as some of the early poets called it. It served as inspiration for calligraphy, for music, and for the kind of philosophy that only really makes sense until you try to reread it when you're sober. Even Confucius, the man who would become the champion of discipline, warned against the dangers of drunkenness with the sort of weary tone that strongly suggests he had some personal experience with it. So, while other civilizations were still trying to figure out how to keep their beer from exploding, the Chinese were already holding formal banquets, raising a toast to their ancestors, and probably forgetting about half of their toasts by the time dessert was served. Civilization, it would seem, doesn't truly begin until someone is offering spiritual enlightenment with a side of fermented fruit. If there is one single thing that unites all of the early civilizations, it's their shared determination to make sure that someone was drinking while the invention of writing was taking place. In Mesopotamia, around 2700 BCE, alcohol wasn't just a simple beverage, it was a plot device. The world's oldest known story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, reads like an ancient cautionary tale about friendship, mortality, and the dangers of drinking outside of your comfort zone. The story introduces us to Enkidu, a wild man who lives among the animals until a woman manages to lure him into civilization with two very persuasive arguments: bread and beer. After his first drink, Enkidu became human, which is a very polite way of saying that he discovered the magic of having lowered standards. The Sumerians didn't believe that alcohol corrupted man. They believed that it completed him. Somewhere out there, a modern philosopher is still trying to argue that same point, but with a lot less evidence. In Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just a social lubricant. It was spiritual. The temples often doubled as breweries. Priests would moonlight as bartenders, and the offerings that were made to the gods frequently included a fresh pint. Archaeologists have unearthed clay tablets that feature ancient recipes, which are literal hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. They read less like holy scripture and more like a medieval pub song: praise the brew, stir the mash, and may your liver manage to hold out for another year. Beer was widely considered to be liquid bread, a phrase that made the act of fasting sound virtuous and happy hour sound holy. It was also a practical solution, a way to preserve grain and keep it from rotting. Workers who were building the temples and canals received daily rations of beer as their wages. Somewhere between the fifth and the sixth sip, civilization finally started to make a bit more sense, with people writing contracts, dividing up labor, and occasionally passing out right next to the ziggurat. The result of all this was history's first bureaucracy, and it was fueled by barley. Accountants kept detailed records of beer rations, priests would bless the barrels, and poets immortalized the feeling of a good buzz. Ancient tablets have even been found that include complaints from workers about receiving beer that was too weak. That's right. The world's very first piece of customer service feedback was a 4,000-year-old Yelp review about watered-down ale. So, while philosophers would later spend their time debating the meaning of life, the people of Mesopotamia had already found it at the bottom of a communal beer pot. Humanity's first great epic didn't just celebrate heroism. It celebrated the universal truth that no great story ever began with someone eating a salad. If Mesopotamia drank for the sake of civilization and Egypt drank for the sake of religion, then the Greeks drank for the sake of conversation, and sometimes to forget the conversation they had just finished. By 600 BCE, Greece had elevated alcohol from being a mere form of refreshment to a full-blown social institution. The symposium, a word that literally translates to drinking together, which, to be fair, is still a fundamental cornerstone of Western philosophy. A symposium wasn't exactly a tavern or a frat party, though it has to be said that the line was often quite thin. It was a structured drinking event that came with its own set of rules, music, poetry, and at least one person who was pretending to be profound. The guests would recline on couches, servants would pour the wine, and everyone would discuss ethics until the ethics no longer seemed to matter. They even went so far as to appoint a symposiarch, who was the designated adult in the room and whose job it was to water down the wine. This was because Greek wine was so potent that it could make a Spartan want to hug someone. And yes, they almost always watered it down. Mixing wine with water was considered the mark of a civilized person. Drinking it straight was seen as barbaric, something that the Thracians did right before they invaded your city. The Greeks genuinely believed that moderation was what separated man from beast, which is a bit ironic when you consider that the average symposium usually ended with someone crying, singing, or waking up next to a broken lyre. The gods, of course, had their own drinking scene. Dionysus, the god of wine and chaos, was the divine patron of both the theater and of hangovers. His followers would roam through the countryside, dancing, shouting, and generally making modern music festivals look like knitting clubs. To the Greeks, intoxication wasn't just a form of indulgence. It was a state of temporary madness that was blessed by the heavens themselves. Philosophers weren't immune to its charms either. Plato, in his dialogue Symposium, used the act of drinking as a metaphor for love and divine truth, because apparently nothing says eternal wisdom quite like slurred metaphysics. One can easily imagine Socrates, cup in hand, insisting that virtue is knowledge, while everyone else around him was busy debating whose cup that actually was. The Greeks did, however, give the world its first recorded hangover cure, which was to eat cabbage before you started drinking. It didn't actually work, of course, but it did serve to confirm humanity's eternal optimism in the face of making bad decisions. So, yes, the Greeks mixed their logic with wine, their reason with chaos, and in doing so, they gave birth to Western philosophy somewhere in between refills. Civilization had discovered something crucial. Deep thoughts are always a little bit easier when you can blame them on the alcohol. Every civilization has its own party god, but the Greeks really outdid everyone with Dionysus, the divine embodiment of wine, ecstasy, and having very poor impulse control. While other deities were busy handing down moral codes and laws, Dionysus would show up barefoot, holding a bottle and basically say, "Let's go feel something." His cult spread across the Mediterranean like spilled wine. His followers, who were mostly women known as Maenads, would abandon their homes to join these wild processions up into the mountains. There, under the influence of fermented grape juice and a whole lot of divine enthusiasm, they would sing, dance, and occasionally tear apart small animals, which was the ancient equivalent of festival chaos, but with a religious twist. To any outsiders, this all looked completely insane, but to the believers, it was a state of transcendence. The Greeks saw the state of drunkenness not as a sin, but as a divine condition, a kind of temporary madness that stripped away all logic and allowed mortals to catch a glimpse of the gods. In short, Dionysus was history's very first spiritual excuse for making some bad decisions. His festivals, which were called the Dionysia, were wild, joyful, and completely mandatory. They began as wine-soaked parades and eventually ended up inventing theater. Yes, you heard that right. Western drama literally began as a drinking festival. Tragedy and comedy were born in the very same place where someone once probably shouted, "Hey, who drank all the amphory?" Actors would wear masks, choruses would sing hymns, and playwrights would compete against each other for prizes, all while the audience maintained a polite level of intoxication that modern critics might refer to as immersive participation. But Dionysus wasn't all just one big party. His myths also came with a warning that rejecting joy could be a very dangerous thing. King Pentheus tried to ban his cult, calling it indecent, a decision that ended quite poorly for him when the Maenads, in a frenzy, mistook him for a lion and solved the problem in a very violent manner. The moral of that story is to never get between a Greek and their plans for the weekend. For the philosophers, Dionysus represented the chaos that lives inside the human soul, the complete opposite of Apollo, the god of order. Together, they symbolize the eternal tension that exists between reason and instinct. Or, to put it in less academic terms, the voice in your head that says you should be responsible, and the other voice that says one more drink won't hurt. In Dionysus, the Greeks found both creation and destruction, the pure bliss of losing control and the inevitable hangover that follows enlightenment. Civilization, it turns out, needed both of these gods. After all, without Apollo, we would have no structure, and without Dionysus, we would have no stories that are worth telling. When it came to alcohol, the Romans didn't just drink, they industrialized it. If the Greeks drank for the sake of philosophy, then the Romans drank for literally everything else: politics, religion, hygiene, and sheer boredom. They had a saying, "In vino veritas," which means in wine there is truth. This probably explains why so many Roman truths ended up leading to bad decisions and the crowning of new emperors. Wine was the very fuel of the empire. It flowed through the aqueducts of their social life, from the slums all the way to the Senate. Everybody drank it: soldiers, farmers, slaves, emperors, and even the gods in their myths. It was considered so essential that soldiers received daily rations of wine instead of water, which does raise a few questions about Roman military strategy. Marching for hundreds of miles through Gaul while being mildly buzzed was certainly a bold move. Caesar. Roman vineyards stretched all across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. They cultivated hundreds of different varieties, none of which were aged, filtered, or remotely pleasant to drink. Ancient wine was syrupy, acidic, and often mixed with things like honey, herbs, sea water, or pretty much anything else that might distract from its actual taste. Think less of a fine vintage and more of a liquid dare. At their feasts, guests would recline on couches, surrounded by silver cups and a whole lot of regret. Servants would pour endlessly while musicians played, and philosophers would shout half-coherent Latin about the nature of virtue. Drinking wasn't about the taste, it was about status. The richer the Roman, the more bizarre the ingredients in their wine. Caligula supposedly mixed pearls into his wine just to prove how wealthy he was, or perhaps to explain why everyone at dinner looked so terrified. Of course, there were some attempts at moderation. The Stoics warned against drinking in excess, claiming that self-control was the true path to wisdom. But the Stoics were also the same people who had to live under the rule of Nero, so one can forgive them for occasionally breaking their own rules. Public drunkenness wasn't condemned. In fact, it was expected. Poets wrote verses about their hangovers, and even the gods were known to drink heavily. Bacchus, the Roman version of Dionysus, had his own festivals that were so chaotic that the Senate eventually had to ban them. Naturally, that just made them twice as popular. Rome built roads, aqueducts, and entire empires. But its true legacy might just be social drinking. When the empire finally fell, it wasn't just due to barbarians or politics. It was, at least in part, due to the eternal Roman habit of raising a glass and saying, "We'll just deal with it tomorrow." While the Greeks were philosophizing over their wine and the Romans were practically drowning in it, the Persians were turning the act of drinking into literature. They treated wine the same way that most people treat religion, with devotion, with ritual, and with the occasional public scandal. In ancient Achaemenid Persia, the kings would host banquets that were large enough to feed a small city. The historian Herodotus claimed that guests were expected to get drunk and then make important decisions. This was because, according to Persian logic, a plan that had been tested while both sober and intoxicated had double the integrity. This was a system that probably worked quite well until someone suggested invading Greece right after dessert. But the real poetry of wine came centuries later, during the Islamic Golden Age, when alcohol became a theological controversy with a nice side of irony. The Quran had banned it, and yet Persian poets simply couldn't stop writing about it. They called it the forbidden nectar, the ruby of the soul, and liquid wisdom. Basically, it was the world's first creative loophole. No one ever mastered the art of poetic intoxication quite like Omar Khayyam, the 11th century astronomer, mathematician, and wine enthusiast who managed to turn hangovers into haikus. His collection of poems, the Rubaiyat, reads like a soft rebellion, with verses that are dripping with nostalgia, philosophy, and some subtle blasphemy. "A jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou," he wrote, which is the ancient Persian way of saying date night under house arrest. In truth, Persian society had a very complex relationship with the bottle. Publicly, wine was considered sinful. Privately, it was practically an art form. Aristocrats would drink in lush gardens, surrounded by fountains, poetry, and a healthy dose of plausible deniability. They would toast to love, to beauty, and occasionally to the hypocrisy of their own laws. It was the kind of cultural tension that only a civilization that was both brilliant and deeply self-aware could ever sustain. Persian physicians even prescribed wine for health reasons, diluted of course, to strengthen the spirit and improve digestion. So yes, even medieval doctors were in the business of giving out excuses. By the time that travelers from Europe started to arrive, they were shocked to find that the Persians, who were officially a dry nation, were quietly running some of the most refined wineries in the entire world. The Persian relationship with alcohol was a delicate balancing act. One hand was busy writing scripture, while the other was uncorking a metaphor. They didn't just drink to forget. They drank to remember things beautifully. While Rome was sipping its spiced wine and reciting poetry about its empire, the so-called barbarians of Northern Europe were busy doing something far more efficient: getting unapologetically drunk. The Celts, the Germans, and the Norse didn't really care about things like etiquette, philosophy, or the proper dilution ratios. They cared about results, namely, forgetting about the winter and improving their confidence before heading into battle. The Greeks referred to them as barbarians because they didn't mix their wine with water. The barbarians, in turn, called the Greeks boring. Their preferred drinks were mead and ale, both of which were served in quantities that could easily drown a small child. Mead, which is fermented honey and water, was the drink of heroes, of kings, and of anyone who could manage to stand upright long enough to refill their horn. The Vikings believed that mead came from the gods themselves, specifically from a mythical vat that was filled with honey and poetry. The fact that this particular beverage inspired both war songs and spontaneous axe-throwing contests says a lot about its overall effectiveness. The Celts had their own type of beer, which was brewed in clay pots and flavored with various herbs instead of hops. They would drink it from communal bowls, shouting out toasts that probably sounded quite inspiring at the time and completely incoherent the next morning. In Celtic culture, hospitality meant refilling your guest's cup until they either achieved spiritual enlightenment or simply passed out. Meanwhile, the Germans had developed an ale that was so strong that even the Roman diplomats mentioned it with a note of caution. When the historian Tacitus wrote about the German tribes, he described them as being fierce, brave, and very fond of drunken councils, which is the ancient Latin way of saying that they kept making military plans that they couldn't remember. But drinking wasn't just a form of recreation for them. It was a ritual. To the northern tribes, alcohol was what connected them to their ancestors and to their gods. Warriors would drink before going on raids to gain courage, and they would drink after the battle to forget what they had done with that courage. Mead was considered sacred at funerals, at weddings, and at pretty much any occasion that could be made slightly louder. When Rome finally fell, it wasn't the barbarians' drinking habits that shocked them. It was the realization that these so-called uncivilized people had been celebrating life the entire time. Where Rome had laws, they had toasts. Where Rome had rhetoric, they had rhythm. In the end, the so-called barbarians didn't just conquer the empire, they outdrank it. And that in its own way might just be history's most intoxicating victory. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed, it left behind three things: bad roads, suspicious-looking water, and an enormous collective hangover. Into that chaos stepped a new kind of hero, the monk. They didn't wear any armor, they didn't wield any swords, and they didn't chase after glory. They brewed beer. Yes, while the barbarians were busy inventing new kingdoms and plundering libraries, the monks were quietly perfecting the art of fermentation. In cold, drafty monasteries from France all the way to Bavaria, they discovered that beer could be more than just a survival fluid. It could be a form of holy hydration. During periods of fasting, when solid food was forbidden but liquids were still allowed, the monks would brew a thick, nourishing beer that they nicknamed liquid bread. It was a form of practical theology. Obey God, stay hydrated, and feel pleasantly detached from all of your earthly suffering. Medieval monastic beer wasn't the light, golden brew that we are familiar with today. It was dense, it was cloudy, and it was packed with calories. It was more like a meal that you could pour than a drink you could chug. The monks refined their recipes. They experimented with different yeasts, and they standardized their brewing temperatures centuries before craft beer became a personality trait. Some of them even kept brewing logs that were more detailed than the royal chronicles, because, priorities. Every monastery had its own unique style. The Benedictines favored a malty sweetness. The Cistercians aimed for purity, and the Trappists perfected the art of patience, which is the most useful virtue to have when your entire existence revolves around waiting for something to ferment. Beer wasn't just for sustenance, either. It was an economic engine. The monks would sell it to pilgrims, to travelers, and to anyone who was desperate to forget about feudalism for an evening. The church tolerated all of this because, frankly, it worked. Beer was much safer to drink than water, and it kept the general populace content. A mildly intoxicated peasantry was a peaceful one, and since the monasteries controlled the production, holiness managed to stay comfortably profitable. Some historians even credit these monks with saving beer itself. Without their careful and meticulous record-keeping, the art of brewing might have vanished right alongside Roman plumbing and dental hygiene. Instead, they managed to turn it into a science. Today, when you crack open a Belgian ale, you are tasting the legacy of men who took vows of silence and then went on to invent a drink that made that silence enjoyable. So, while the knights were out winning glory and the kings were busy claiming their crowns, the monks won something far more enduring: the eternal gratitude of anyone who has ever needed to make medieval life just a little more bearable. While the monks were busy brewing salvation one barrel at a time, everyone else in medieval Europe was simply trying to stay cheerful, or at the very least, hydrated. Enter mead, the golden, honey-based ancestor of all comfort drinks. Before hops became fashionable, mead was the sweet, sticky drink of choice for kings, for peasants, and for anyone who needed to forget about the weather for a few hours. Mead had ancient roots, but it found its true calling during the Dark Ages, when it shone like liquid sunlight in a world that was filled with mud and superstition. It was incredibly easy to make. Just some honey, some water, and a little bit of reckless optimism. Fermentation took care of the rest. In Northern Europe, where grapes refused to grow and the barley would freeze for half the year, mead became the closest thing to happiness you could find in a cup. The Norsemen treated it as if it were divine. According to their legends, the gods themselves drank from the mead of poetry, a celestial brew that was said to grant wisdom, eloquence, and occasionally some terrible singing. Viking skalds would compose verses about it, which might explain why half of their poetry reads like a drunk text that has been carved into a stone. A proper Viking feast wasn't measured by the amount of food, but by how many horns of mead you could survive before you started declaring your eternal brotherhood with the furniture. Further south, mead became the wedding drink of choice. Newlyweds were given enough honey wine to last for an entire moon cycle, which is where the term honeymoon comes from, a romantic tradition that originally involved two people and one very, very long hangover. The peasants, meanwhile, would make simpler versions of it with whatever honey they could find, sometimes spicing it with herbs, and sometimes with bugs. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but it worked. After a long day of laboring in the fields, a warm mug of mead could turn even the grim reality of feudalism into a mild comedy. The monks brewed it too because, well, the monks brewed everything. They used mead in their medicine, in their cooking, and presumably in their diplomacy. It was sweet, it was shelf-stable, and it was a lot easier to bless than wine was. By the 13th century, mead had started to lose ground to both beer and wine, but it never quite disappeared completely. It just lingered, the quiet, golden ghost of Europe's drinking past. A drink that was born from bees and from boredom, reminding everyone that sometimes history doesn't advance. It just refills the cup. As medieval Europe was busy perfecting the art of never drinking responsibly, the Islamic world was moving in the complete opposite direction, at least on paper. When Islam spread across the Middle East in the 7th century, it brought with it a very clear message. Alcohol was haram, which means it was forbidden. In theory, that should have put an end to centuries of intoxication. In practice, however, it turned drinking into one of history's longest-running winks. Before the arrival of Islam, the Arabian Peninsula was already quite familiar with its liquors. The Bedouins would brew date wine. The Persians loved their poetry and their pomegranate cocktails, and everyone was in agreement that hangovers were a universal experience. Then came the Prophet Muhammad, who outlawed alcohol, not out of spite, but for survival. Drunken camel races were ending poorly, and someone had to be the adult in the room. The early caliphs enforced sobriety with an admirable amount of effort, but the empire was growing much faster than its rules could keep up. From Spain all the way to Persia, the local customs proved to be quite resilient. Court poets kept on writing suspiciously passionate odes to wine, which they always insisted was just a metaphor for divine love. Of course, that divine love also had a tendency to make you hiccup, sing, and confess things to total strangers. Nowhere was this contradiction more delicious than in the city of Baghdad. By the 9th century, it had become the center of art, of science, and of polite disobedience. The Abbasid caliphs had officially banned wine, but they kept private gardens where the fountains didn't always flow with water. The poet Abu Nuwas, who was Baghdad's most charming menace, filled entire volumes with verses about drinking under the moonlight, lines that were so beautiful that religious scholars spent centuries arguing over whether he was being spiritual or just sarcastic. Meanwhile, physicians were prescribing wine for digestive harmony. The Sufis were using intoxication as a metaphor for mystical union, and the merchants were quietly trading grapes behind the mosques. The official stance was one of sobriety, but the unofficial one was one of curiosity. By the 12th century, Islamic chemists had even managed to refine the process of distillation, producing early forms of spirits, though they mostly referred to it as medicine to avoid any awkward questions. Ironically enough, the word alcohol itself actually comes from the Arabic al-kul, which means the essence. The very language that had banned it also gave it a name. So yes, the Islamic world did go dry officially. Unofficially, it just learned how to pour its rebellion into verse. By the 13th century, Europe had finally managed to sober up just enough to invent the tavern, a public house where everyone could drink together, argue about their taxes, and forget that they were peasants for a few glorious hours. It was like democracy before democracy existed, only it was a lot louder and slightly stickier. The taverns quickly became the social engine of medieval life. The lords had their castles, the priests had their cathedrals, but the ordinary people had the pub. You didn't need to have any wealth or a fancy pedigree to get in. You just needed a thirst and enough coins to make it past the front door. Inside, the floor was covered in straw, the air was thick with smoke, and the rules were simple. Drink, sing, and pretend that all of your problems were the king's fault. They started popping up everywhere, along the trade routes near the markets and right beside the churches, because convenience matters. For travelers, the taverns were lifesavers. For the locals, they were like therapy with a handle. It was the one place where a blacksmith could debate theology with a monk, a farmer could complain about his rent to a knight, and everyone could agree that the ale had tasted better last week. Alewives, the women who brewed and sold beer, were the ones who ran many of these establishments. They were entrepreneurial, they were fierce, and they were often accused of being witches, mostly because their success made the men feel uncomfortable. Their trade signs, which were broomsticks, cats, and cauldrons, later went on to inspire much of the witch imagery that we are familiar with today. So yes, medieval feminism apparently smelled faintly of hops. The taverns also became the birthplace of politics. Revolutions don't start in palaces. They start wherever someone is shouting, "You know what we should do," over their third mug of ale. From the peasant uprisings in England to the conspiracies that shaped Renaissance Italy, history's boldest ideas often began in places that had questionable sanitation. The authorities absolutely hated the taverns for that exact reason. The kings feared sedition, the priests feared sin, and the innkeepers feared running out of beer. Still, the taverns managed to survive every single crackdown because shutting down drinking in the Middle Ages was like trying to ban the rain. It just moved to a different location. By the end of the 15th century, the taverns weren't just simple hangouts. They were a part of the culture. They gave Europe its gossip, its folk songs, its revolutions, and perhaps most importantly, its first public bathrooms of a sort. Civilization had finally created a place where everyone could gather together, disagree with each other, and then stumble home together. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had spent the better part of a millennium drinking its way through disease, famine, and theology. When the Renaissance finally arrived, everyone simply traded in their mead for wine and called it progress. The new age of reason was, ironically enough, completely soaked in alcohol. Scholars would debate things like astronomy, anatomy, and metaphysics, usually over a jug of something that had been fermented. Da Vinci drank in moderation, Michelangelo preferred wine to water, and Erasmus once joked that no one could think clearly on an empty stomach or with a dry throat. Civilization was starting to sober up intellectually, but not physically. The printing press was spreading knowledge, but the taverns were spreading opinions much faster. Coffee houses hadn't arrived on the scene yet, so beer remained Europe's unofficial Wi-Fi. It connected the merchants, the artists, the sailors, and anyone else who could still afford to buy a cup. New beverages were starting to appear as well: distilled spirits from the alchemists' labs, sweet wines from the Mediterranean, and early tonics that claimed they could cure everything except for hangovers. The age of exploration also became the age of exporting alcoholism. European ships carried wine, rum, and brandy to every single corner of the known world, ensuring that no civilization would ever again have to suffer the tragedy of sobriety. Colonial merchants made their fortunes on sugar and spirits, and the sailors drank enough rum to keep scurvy at bay, or at least to not care about it. At home, drinking became a kind of social performance. Royal banquets featured fountains that flowed with wine, because nothing says divine right quite like having sticky floors. Henry VIII brewed his own ale, which just goes to show that you can dismantle a church and still be very committed to home brewing. Meanwhile, the peasants continued with their eternal tradition of drinking the same weak ale, and pretending not to notice that nothing had really changed for them. By the 17th century, Europe was standing on the edge of modernity, with printing, science, and political reform, but it was still firmly clutching its mug. The church had its doctrines, the universities had their logic, and the taverns had better attendance. It's tempting to think of alcohol as just a side note to history, but it's actually much closer to being the soundtrack. From the ancient rice brews to the vineyards of the Renaissance, the story of civilization isn't just about invention, it's about endurance. And humanity, ever resourceful, found that a little bit of fermentation made that endurance taste a whole lot better. The year was 41 BCE. Rome stood fractured. Its triumvirs were uneasy allies in the aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar. Mark Antony, the brilliant but impulsive general, had been sent to the east to restore order and to secure the loyalty of Rome's provinces. Yet beyond the world of politics, a woman awaited who had the power to alter the course of empires: Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt. Antony had summoned her to the city of Tarsus to answer charges that she had provided aid to Caesar's enemies. It was a clear power play, Rome reminding Egypt exactly who it was that ruled the Mediterranean. But Cleopatra had absolutely no intention of showing up as a supplicant. Instead, she arrived as a goddess. Her barge sailed up the Cydnus River, draped in purple sails that caught the sunlight like molten gold. Perfume wafted across the water, and musicians played as her attendants fanned her throne. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as the incarnation of Isis, the goddess of fertility and power. When Antony finally laid his eyes on her, the balance of power shifted. He had faced down legions, conspiracies, and kings, but he had never before faced a woman who could command silence with just a single glance. Cleopatra understood the art of performance better than any other ruler of her time. She knew that perception was power, and she had crafted her entrance just as carefully as Rome had forged its swords. Antony, who was both a soldier and a sensualist, found himself completely enthralled. The two of them dined together that night in a spectacle that outshone any Roman triumph, with banquets of roasted peacocks, jeweled goblets that were brimming with wine, and laughter that lingered on until the dawn. Yet beneath all the silk and the gold, there was a strategy. Cleopatra's throne was in a precarious position. Egypt depended on Rome's favor for its very survival. Aligning herself with Antony could secure her kingdom's future, and her son Caesarion's claim as the true heir of Julius Caesar. Antony, meanwhile, saw in her not only a lover, but an ally of immense wealth and mystique. Egypt's riches could be used to fuel his own ambitions against his rival, Octavian, back in Rome. That night, two worlds collided: the disciplined steel of Roman authority and the perfumed splendor of Egyptian divinity. Their meeting was more than just passion. It was politics that was wrapped in seduction, an empire that was disguised as a romance. And from that very first encounter, neither of them would ever rule or love in the same way again. In the weeks that followed, Mark Antony remained in Cleopatra's orbit, first as a guest, and then as something far more intimate. Their alliance grew not just from desire, but from a shared ambition. Antony saw in Cleopatra the embodiment of everything that Rome had lost: grandeur without restraint, wealth without guilt, and beauty that was entwined with power. Cleopatra, in turn, saw in him the instrument of her own political survival, a man who could restore Egypt's influence in the Mediterranean and secure her son's future. Antony was captivated by the queen's intellect just as much as he was by her allure. Cleopatra was fluent in multiple languages. She was quick with her wit, and she was utterly fearless in debate. She could discuss philosophy with the same ease that she could order entire fleets into the Nile. Unlike the Roman women who were bound by decorum, Cleopatra ruled with an unashamed sovereignty. To Antony, who had spent years living under the shadow of Caesar and the constant scrutiny of Rome's Senate, her presence was intoxicating. She offered him something that the Republic never could: freedom from politics that was disguised as duty. Their days were spent in lavish feasts, in philosophical conversations, and in carefully staged games. Together, they formed the Inimitable Livers, a private society that was devoted to excess, luxury, and laughter. They would disguise themselves at night and wander through the streets of Alexandria in playful anonymity, drinking with the sailors, mocking the magistrates, and living like mortals instead of monarchs. The city absolutely adored them. Cleopatra's charisma turned every single public appearance into a piece of theater, and Antony's rough charm complemented her perfectly. But while they were reveling, The world beyond their golden walls was changing. In Rome, Octavian, who was Julius Caesar's adopted son, was watching Antony's behavior with a growing suspicion. Every rumor of debauchery, every tale of Egyptian splendor, reached his ears and stoked his resentment. To Octavian, Antony was no longer a Roman hero, but a man who had been seduced by an Eastern temptress, one who was threatening the very unity of the Republic itself. Still, Antony dismissed all of these whispers as nothing more than envy. He believed that his military prowess and his name could withstand any scandal. Cleopatra encouraged his confidence, gifting him ships, silver, and soldiers to help secure his campaigns. Together, they forged not only a romance, but a partnership that was meant to rival the might of Rome itself. In Alexandria, they were the king and queen of both pleasure and power. Two rulers in love, defying the empire that was seeking to divide them. But Rome, jealous and unrelenting, was already sharpening its knives. By the time Antony returned to Alexandria in 37 BCE, his bond with Cleopatra had evolved from one of indulgence to a calculated alliance. The queen had proven herself to be indispensable. Egypt's treasury was overflowing with grain, with gold, and with the fabled wealth of the Nile that Rome's legions could never seem to fully plunder. For Antony, who dreamed of surpassing Caesar's glory and ruling over the entire Eastern world, Cleopatra was both his muse and his means. She welcomed him with the splendor of a pharaoh. Banquets glittered beneath ceilings of silver stars, and dancers reenacted the divine union of Isis and Osiris, symbolizing their own partnership. Cleopatra presented Antony with gifts not of love, but of empire, ships for his campaigns, soldiers who were trained in Egyptian archery and the loyalty of the eastern provinces. In return, Antony granted her territories, including Cyprus, Crete, and parts of Syria and Cilicia, restoring much of Egypt's former Ptolemaic domain. It was a gesture that absolutely infuriated Rome, which saw its general carving away pieces of the Republic for a foreign queen. To their followers, however, Antony and Cleopatra appeared as divine counterparts. He was the new Dionysus, the god of wine and conquest, and she was Isis, the mother of kings. Together, they styled themselves as the rulers of the East, openly embracing the grandeur of monarchy that Rome pretended to despise but secretly envied. Antony's Roman discipline began to soften. He started dressing in Eastern robes, he adopted Egyptian rituals, and he held court in the lavish palace that overlooked the Nile. Cleopatra bore him twins, a boy and a girl who were named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, symbols of their union's divine legitimacy. Their births were celebrated as omens of a new dynasty that would finally unite the East and the West. Cleopatra saw in her children not just heirs, but living proof that her bloodline could outlast Rome's. Yet not everyone was rejoicing. In the marble halls of the Senate, the whispers had turned into outrage. Antony's distribution of kingdoms to Cleopatra's children, the so-called donations of Alexandria, was viewed as an act of treason. To the Romans, he was no longer a protector of their interests, but a man who had been bewitched, handing over the world's riches to an Egyptian seductress. In their palace, the lovers toasted to eternity beneath the fragrance of lotus and myrrh. But beyond the Nile, The storm clouds were gathering. Octavian's propaganda machine began to paint them as enemies of Roman virtue, a decadent queen and a fallen hero, who were daring to dream of an empire in defiance of the Republic. As the years went by, Antony and Cleopatra built a world that seemed to float somewhere between myth and power, a realm of pleasure that was gilded by ambition. Alexandria became the beating heart of their empire, a place where politics was conducted in marble halls that were perfumed with incense, and where feasts became councils of strategy. The queen's court shimmered with philosophers, with engineers, and with poets, each of them serving her vision of an Egypt that was reborn under a divine rule. Antony, the hardened general who had once commanded the armies of Rome, found himself completely transformed. No longer bound by the scorn of the Senate, he reveled in the Egyptian ideal of kingship, a god among men. He would train his legions by day and then feast by night, hosting spectacles that blurred the line between politics and performance. Cleopatra would join him in armor on parade, presenting herself as Isis standing beside her consort, Dionysus. Together, they would appear before the crowds on golden thrones, uniting the strength of Rome and the divinity of Egypt into a single image of unchallengeable majesty. Yet, behind all of the music and the opulence, their empire was teetering on the edge of peril. Antony's campaigns against Parthia, which was the eastern rival of Rome, had ended in humiliation. The desert had devoured his army, his legions were starving and frostbitten, and they were retreating through mountains that were littered with corpses. It was a disaster that Rome would not forgive. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, met him upon his return not with reproach but with comfort. She financed the rebuilding of his forces, she replenished his coffers, and she restored his pride. Their alliance, which had once been romantic, was now bound by necessity and by survival. Still, their enemies were multiplying. Octavian, watching from Rome, seized upon Antony's failures and wove them into a scandal. He claimed that Antony had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, who was Octavian's own sister, for the Egyptian queen. Rumors began to spread that Antony was planning to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria and to declare Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, the rightful heir of Julius Caesar. In Alexandria, the lovers dismissed all of this talk with laughter. Yet, the laughter was growing strained. The world beyond their palace was no longer dazzled by their legend. To many Romans, Cleopatra was no longer a queen but a threat, a foreign sorceress who had ensnared their general and corrupted him with the decadence of the East. Still, for a brief, luminous moment, they ruled as gods in a mortal world, while Rome, restless and vengeful, prepared to strike. By 33 BCE, the illusion of peace between Antony and Octavian had completely shattered. Their alliance, which had once been bound by the memory of Julius Caesar, crumbled under the weight of jealousy, ambition, and fear. Octavian, who was now the political master of Rome, moved swiftly to turn the Republic against Antony and Cleopatra. He weaponized rumor with an incredible precision, transforming their romance into a scandal and their grandeur into an act of treason. He circulated tales of Cleopatra's sorcery, claiming that she had bewitched Antony with foreign magic and had reduced him to nothing more than her puppet. Statues of the once great general were mocked in the streets, dressed in silk and gold to make him resemble an Eastern despot. Pamphlets accused him of giving away Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children, and of plotting to crown both himself and her as the rulers of the world. Octavian presented himself as Rome's savior, promising to free the Republic from the enslavement of a queen. The Senate, which was hungry for an enemy to unite them, followed his lead. Antony, for his part, refused to bow. He still commanded vast armies in the east and had the loyalty of seasoned legions who had fought alongside him for years. But the damage to his reputation had been done. In speeches and in letters, Octavian painted him as a traitor who had traded his Roman virtue for Egyptian decadence. Even Antony's friends in the Senate began to withdraw their support, fearful of sharing his fate. Cleopatra understood propaganda just as well as any Roman did. She urged Antony to act decisively, to strike before Octavian could consolidate his power. But Antony hesitated, torn between two worlds, the disciplined general that Rome had made him and the god-king that Egypt had turned him into. Their love, which had once been their greatest strength, now served to divide him. Cleopatra's counsel was bold, but it came from the perspective of a monarch, not a statesman. She was fighting for a dynasty, while he was fighting for his dignity. In 32 BCE, Octavian took the final step. He declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke. By making the Egyptian queen the enemy, he framed the conflict as one of civilization versus corruption. Rome would not be marching against one of its own, but against a foreign queen who had dared to seduce a Roman hero. And thus, love itself became the battlefield. The lovers would stand together, knowing that to fight for one another now meant to fight against the greatest empire the world had ever known. As war loomed, Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in Greece. The year was 31 BCE, and the air was thick with tension and with prophecy. Their combined armies were vast, hundreds of warships, tens of thousands of soldiers, and enough gold to fund a decade of conflict. Yet beneath the glitter of the banners and the bronze, an unease lingered. The soldiers were loyal, but the cause was muddled. Were they fighting for Antony's honor or for Cleopatra's crown, for Rome or for love? Antony established his headquarters at Patri, while Cleopatra arrived with her fleet of magnificent galleys, adorned with purple sails and gilded prows. Her presence served to divide his officers. To some, she was a symbol of divine fortune. To others, she was a distraction that was eroding Roman discipline. The commanders whispered that Antony had surrendered his strategy to his passion. Yet, Cleopatra brought more than just her beauty. She brought money, provisions, and a fleet that had been trained on the Nile, disciplined and fierce. Without her, Antony's campaign would have starved before it had even begun. Their enemies, led by Octavian and his brilliant admiral, Agrippa, advanced methodically. Agrippa seized key ports along the western coast, cutting off Antony's supply lines and isolating his fleet. Antony's officers urged him to fight on land, where his legions held the advantage. But Cleopatra, who was wary of another desert disaster, insisted on a naval battle. She believed that the size of her fleet and the favorable winds of the Ionian Sea would be enough to turn the tide. Antony, who was ever torn between love and logic, agreed. The lovers spent their final days before the battle together in a tense stillness, half strategy, half farewell. Cleopatra tried to mask her fear behind a regal poise, while Antony, weary and uncertain, sought out omens that refused to favor him. The priest's readings were grim, and the stars were indifferent. When the dawn broke over the Gulf of Actium, the sea shimmered like a mirror of fate. Antony's ships, which were massive but unwieldy, faced off against Octavian's smaller, more agile fleet. Cleopatra's flagship gleamed at the center, a beacon of gold amidst the mist. On the shore, thousands of soldiers watched, waiting for victory, or for the end of everything they had served. It was not merely a battle between two armies. It was the reckoning of two worlds, Roman order against Egyptian splendor, discipline against desire. And before the sun would set, love itself would be tested by fire and by iron. On the 2nd of September, 31 BCE, the dawn over the Gulf of Actium glowed red, an omen that the Egyptians read with dread. Cleopatra's fleet glittered with its golden prows and purple sails, while Antony's warships formed a massive semicircle across the calm sea. On the opposite side, Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, commanded leaner, faster vessels, perfectly suited for maneuverability and discipline. The world's greatest powers were facing each other across the water, and history itself seemed to be holding its breath. The first clash came with the roar of rams striking hulls and the hiss of flaming arrows cutting through the air. Antony's ships, though powerful, were heavy and slow. Agrippa's forces danced around them like hornets, burning their sails and piercing their decks. The chaos grew, with smoke turning the bright day into a choking twilight. Amid the din, Cleopatra's flagship waited behind Antony's line, its golden canopy trembling with the wind. Then, at the height of the confusion, Cleopatra made her move. Seeing the tide turning against them, or perhaps fearing capture, she raised her sails and steered south, toward the open water. Whether it was an act of panic, a strategic move, or a prearranged escape, no one can say for sure. But Antony, upon seeing her banner retreat, abandoned his command. He leapt into a small vessel and followed her, leaving his fleet completely leaderless. The sight of their commander fleeing shattered the morale of his men. Roman discipline crumbled into chaos. The ships burned, the crews surrendered, and the sea became a graveyard of broken oars and corpses. Agrippa's fleet surged forward, crushing what little remained. By nightfall, the battle was over. Rome had triumphed. When Antony finally reached Cleopatra's ship, the two of them met in silence. The victory banquets of Alexandria, the music, the laughter, all of it seemed like relics from another life. Their empire of love had turned to ash. Cleopatra tried to console him, but Antony's eyes were hollow. He had been a soldier all his life, and he knew exactly what defeat meant: dishonor, exile, and the slow erasure of his name from history. Together, they sailed back to Egypt under a sky that was devoid of stars. The sea that had once carried their triumphs now bore only their ruin. Actium had not merely ended a battle, it had broken the spell that had once bound love and empire together. When Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria after their defeat at Actium, their once mighty empire was just a shadow of its former glory. The city that had once celebrated their splendor now trembled with uncertainty. The merchants whispered, the nobles watched, and the priests prayed. But everyone could feel it. Rome was coming. Still, within the marble halls of the palace, the lovers refused to yield to despair. Cleopatra filled the courts with music and with incense, determined to maintain the illusion of power, even as their world was collapsing around them. Antony, who had once been the lion of Rome, was now broken. He rarely appeared in public, choosing instead to train what few troops remained with a grim determination. He still had the loyalty of a few thousand men, but his spirit was fading. Cleopatra tried to rekindle his strength, reminding him of his past victories, of his name, and of his legend. But Antony knew that Octavian's shadow stretched too far to escape. In his heart, he understood that their story was nearing its end. Cleopatra, however, was not done fighting. She began to engage in secret negotiations with Octavian, sending emissaries who bore gold and promises. Her message was simple: Egypt would surrender peacefully if her children and her throne were spared. She was hopping to save her dynasty, even if her love could not be saved. Octavian, cold and deliberate, listened. He admired her intellect, but he distrusted her motives. To him, Cleopatra was not a queen, but a symbol, a serpent to be displayed in his triumph, not to be reasoned with. Antony soon learned of these secret talks. Betrayal, or at least the illusion of it, cut him deeper than any sword ever could. His rage turned to despair, and his love turned to silence. The palace, which had once been filled with laughter, now echoed only with the sound of footsteps and the distant sound of waves breaking against the harbor walls. Outside of Alexandria, Octavian's legions marched ever closer, their banners glinting in the desert sun. The Nile Delta filled with the rumble of war machines and the scent of dust and iron. Cleopatra ordered her fleet to be burned to prevent its capture. The flames devoured the last symbol of their defiance, casting a black smoke into the Egyptian sky. As night fell over Alexandria, Cleopatra stood upon her balcony and looked toward the west, toward Rome, toward her destiny. She knew that her reign, her love, and perhaps even her life would not see another sunrise. The final act was about to begin. By the summer of 30 BCE, the sands of Egypt had turned red with Rome's advance. Octavian's legions were closing in on Alexandria from every direction, their banners gleaming beneath the relentless sun. Cleopatra's forces, which were outnumbered and demoralized, began to crumble. The city's gates, which had once been the pride of the Ptolemies, now stood as mere symbols of defiance against the inevitable. Inside the palace, Cleopatra and Antony faced the end with the same intensity that had defined their love. Antony, who was haunted by his failure and the loss of his honor, resolved to meet death as a Roman should. When false news reached him that Cleopatra had taken her own life, he fell upon his sword. As he was bleeding out, servants rushed in to tell him the truth, that the queen still lived. Mortally wounded, Antony demanded to be taken to her. They carried him to Cleopatra's hidden chamber, where she had taken refuge in her mausoleum, a glittering tomb that she had built for herself long before her defeat. As he was being lifted through a window, bleeding and pale, Cleopatra held him in her arms. He died there, whispering her name, the last word of a soldier who had conquered half the world but had been conquered by love. Octavian entered Alexandria soon after. He found Cleopatra in mourning but still regal, draped in gold and defiance. He promised her safety, intending to parade her in chains through the streets of Rome as a living trophy of his triumph. But Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, would not be humiliated. She prepared her final act just as carefully as she had once prepared her entrance to Antony's court. On the 12th of August, she adorned herself in her royal robes and seated herself upon her throne one last time. At her feet lay a basket of figs, harmless to the eye but deadly within. Concealed among them was the asp, the sacred serpent of Egypt, a symbol of divine royalty and of death. As it bit her, Cleopatra remained silent, her face serene. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, somewhere between history and myth. When Octavian found her lifeless body, he realized that he had conquered a kingdom but had lost a legend. With Cleopatra's death, the line of the pharaohs came to an end, and Egypt became a province of Rome. Yet her story of love, power, and defiance would echo through the centuries, as eternal as the Nile itself. For a man who had set out to conquer the world, Alexander the Great was ultimately undone not by swords, but by hearts. He was the son of Philip II and was tutored by Aristotle, so Alexander was raised to see power as his destiny. Yet beneath the armor of the conqueror beat a heart that was far more unpredictable than any army he ever commanded. For all of his victories on the battlefield, his greatest rebellions were often against tradition itself. And nowhere was that more clear than in his marriages. In 327 BCE, after years of relentless campaigning across Asia, Alexander met a woman who would defy every single expectation of what a Macedonian queen should be. Her name was Roxana, a Bactrian princess, the daughter of Oxyartes. The story goes that Alexander saw her for the very first time at a feast in the mountain fortress of Sogdian Rock, shortly after his forces had captured it. She danced before him with a dagger in her hand, her movements both fierce and graceful, her eyes completely unflinching. To his generals, she was a captive. To Alexander, she was fire. What happened next shocked his entire court. Instead of sending her back to Macedonia as a trophy or offering her up as a political pawn, Alexander married her. There was no council, no negotiation, and no alliance building, only love. His men grumbled that he had lost his mind, that the greatest conqueror alive had been conquered by a foreign girl. But Alexander didn't care. For perhaps the first time in his entire life, he acted purely from desire. The ceremony was held according to Persian custom, an act that outraged his Macedonian officers, who saw it as yet another sign of Alexander's growing Eastern decadence. Yet to him it was more than just a romance, it was symbolism. By marrying Roxana, he sought to unite the East and the West, to embody his dream of a single, unified empire where cultures could blend together rather than clash. Roxana, who was intelligent and proud, quickly adapted to her new role. She was not the docile queen that many had expected her to be. She was possessive, she was cunning, and she was deeply protective of her husband's legacy. Their union was both tender and dangerous, a passion that was entwined with power. And though she bore him no heir during his lifetime, her hold on his heart was absolute. But Alexander's story and his scandal was only just beginning. Love may have chosen Roxana, but politics would soon demand far more. Roxana might have won Alexander's heart, but she quickly discovered that she was not his only love. In his world, affection was not bound by gender or by convention. For years, one name had followed Alexander across the battlefields and into legend: Hephaestion, his companion since his youth, his confidant in war. Hephaestion was more than just a friend. To many, he was Alexander's other half, the man who understood him in ways that no queen ever could. Roxana soon grew to despise him. She could not rival Hephaestion's history with the king. No feast, no embrace could ever erase the years that they had spent together, riding into battle and sharing command tents. When foreign emissaries addressed Hephaestion as Alexander's equal, Roxana's fury boiled over. To her, it wasn't politics. It was a betrayal. Alexander, however, refused to choose between them. He loved them both in his own way, and he saw no contradiction in it. The Macedonian officers whispered that their king was losing his sense of decorum, indulging in Persian luxuries and scandalous attachments. Some of them even mocked him behind closed doors, calling Hephaestion the second Alexander, but none of them ever dared to confront him openly. Alexander's temper was just as legendary as his affection. When Roxana's jealousy became too fierce to hide, Alexander distanced himself from her. Yet she remained his wife, fiercely devoted, her influence growing quietly behind the palace walls. She understood one truth about Alexander that even Hephaestion sometimes ignored: his need to control his own destiny, even in matters of the heart. Then in 324 BCE, tragedy struck. Hephaestion fell ill in Ecbatana and died suddenly. Alexander was inconsolable. He tore his clothes, he refused to eat, and he ordered temples to be built in Hephaestion's honor. He even declared him to be a demigod, an act that was unheard of for a mortal. The court stood in a stunned silence, realizing that no one, not even Roxana, had ever commanded such devotion from him. For Roxana, Hephaestion's death brought a twisted sense of relief, but it also left her husband completely hollow. She had won the war of jealousy, but it had come at the cost of his soul. In the days that followed, Alexander wandered through the palace like a ghost. The man who had conquered the world now faced a kingdom that he could not subdue: grief. And soon, that grief would drive him into new alliances and new scandals. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander's grief burned into a restless ambition. He needed a distraction, something that was grand enough to drown out his sorrow. That something came in the form of his empire. By 324 BCE, he ruled from Greece all the way to the Indus River. Yet, he knew that conquest alone could not bind his world together. He sought to fuse the bloodlines of Macedonia and Persia, creating a new ruling class that would be loyal to him alone. And as with all of Alexander's visions, it began with a marriage. At Susa, which was the Persian ceremonial capital, he staged a spectacle that the world had never seen before. 90 of his leading officers were to wed noble Persian women in a mass ceremony that was designed to symbolize the unity between the East and the West. And at the center of it all, Alexander himself took 2 brides: Stateira, the daughter of the defeated King Darius III, and Parysatis, the daughter of the Persian king Artaxerxes. It was pure politics disguised as a romance. The marriages cemented his claim to the Achaemenid royal line, legitimizing his rule in the eyes of the Persians. But back in the Macedonian ranks, disgust was simmering. The soldiers who had followed him through deserts and through battles now had to watch their king, dressed in Persian robes, kneeling before a foreign princess. To them, it was a betrayal. A man who had once been hailed as the defender of Greece now looked like the heir of Persia. Roxana, who was still the queen in name, was not invited to the ceremony. Her jealousy was volcanic. She had risked everything to be Alexander's chosen one, and now she was being overshadowed by royal brides who had a higher birth and a greater political significance. But she knew her husband well. Power moved him more than passion ever could. She remained in the shadows, calculating, silent, waiting for her moment. For Alexander, however, the union was more than just symbolic. He believed himself to be the divine bridge between civilizations, a living embodiment of the gods themselves. The marriages were meant to seal his vision of one world, one empire, one destiny. Yet, even as he stood among the garlands and the incense, clasping the hands of Darius's daughter, murmurs of discontent echoed through his court. The Macedonian officers muttered that their king was lost, no longer one of them but a Persian in spirit. Alexander didn't care. He had wedded not just women but entire nations. But love, power, and legacy rarely ever share the same bed. The weddings at Susa were meant to unify Alexander's empire, but they ended up fracturing his army instead. To the Macedonians, who had marched with him all the way from Pella, their king's new Persian identity was a bitter insult. He now wore flowing robes. He demanded prostration before his throne, and he spoke of himself not merely as a king, but as a living god. What had begun as admiration for their leader was slowly turning into a quiet resentment. At the victory feasts, Persian nobles sat beside the Macedonian officers as equals, an unthinkable sight to men who had spent years shedding their blood to defeat them. Alexander's vision of cultural fusion sounded noble in theory, but in practice, it felt like a betrayal. The soldiers began to whisper that their king had gone mad, that he cared more for the Persians he had conquered than for the men who had followed him. The real scandal came when Alexander publicly kissed one of his Persian companions, Bagoas, during a festival, right in front of his entire court. The gesture stunned the Macedonians. To them, such open affection between men, especially from their king, was a humiliation. Bagoas had once been a favorite of Darius III, and now he had become Alexander's. The symbolism of it all was too much for them to bear. The Macedonian lion had inherited not only Persia's empire, but also its courtiers and their vices. Some of the officers tried to remind Alexander of who he was, a Greek king, not an Eastern despot. But Alexander had long since stopped listening. He surrounded himself with flatterers and with mystics who called him the son of Zeus Ammon, destined to rule as a god among men. Those who resisted his transformation often met with grim fates. Cleitus the Black, one of his oldest companions, was slain by Alexander's own hand after he had dared to criticize him during a drunken quarrel. By the time the army reached Babylon, the divide was complete. The soldiers still worshipped their general, but they no longer understood their king. To them, he was lost, consumed by Persian luxury and blinded by love and ambition. But Alexander saw something that they could not, an empire that was bound not by swords, but by marriage, by ritual, and by faith. His vision was magnificent, it was terrifying, and it was utterly his own, and it was about to consume him. Roxana's silence after the weddings at Susa was not an act of forgiveness, it was a calculation. She had watched as Alexander took 2 Persian princesses as his wives before the eyes of the entire world. And though she had smiled for the sake of the ceremony, her fury ran deep. She had once been the only woman in his life, the symbol of his love that went beyond politics. Now, she was just a shadow standing beside 2 royal brides who had a greater lineage and richer dowries. But Roxana was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly. While Alexander was busy celebrating unity, Roxana was studying survival. She knew that in this new empire of blended cultures, the most dangerous battles were fought in the bedroom, not on the battlefield. Her rival, Statera, the daughter of Darius, was a symbol of Persia's royal bloodline, a woman whose very existence legitimized Alexander's rule. Roxana understood exactly what that meant. If Alexander were to die, Statera's son could one day inherit the entire empire. Roxana could not allow that to happen. Her patience finally ended when Alexander fell ill in Babylon in 323 BCE. As the king's strength began to fade, the court fractured. The generals whispered, the wives waited, and ambitions bloomed in every single corridor. When the conqueror of the world finally died, chaos erupted. Roxana moved with a terrifying precision. She summoned Statera and her sister to Babylon under the guise of a reconciliation, and then she had them both murdered. Their bodies were quietly buried, and their names were erased. Roxana's child with Alexander would now be the only heir to his legacy. It was a ruthless act, but in the world that Alexander had built, mercy was a weakness. The same woman who had once danced before him with a blade in her hand now wielded it in his absence. The Macedonian officers turned pale at the rumor of her deed, yet none of them dared to challenge her. She was, after all, the mother of Alexander's son, and in the fragile order that he had left behind, that gave her a power that few could touch. Still, her vengeance came at a price. Roxana had gained an empire's throne, but she had lost the love that had once defined her. In her attempt to protect her own place in history, she had become the very thing that she had once feared. A pawn of politics, a queen who was surrounded by ghosts. Alexander had conquered nations, but Roxana had conquered the aftermath. The empire that Alexander left behind was as vast as it was unstable, stitched together by blood, by ambition, and by love that had gone wrong. After his death, the so-called successors, his generals, tore the world apart in their struggle for power. But amidst all of this chaos, one haunting reminder of his vision still remained: the widows of Susa. The grand marriages that had once symbolized unity were now just cursed relics. Most of the Macedonian officers abandoned their Persian wives the very moment that Alexander's body grew cold. They saw the unions for what they had always been: political theater. The grand dream of a fusion between the East and the West dissolved into resentment and betrayal. For every Persian woman who was left behind, there was a Macedonian general who was eager to forget the entire experiment. Statera, Alexander's Persian bride, was already dead, slain by Roxana's jealousy. But the whispers of her ghost spread among the Persian court. Some said that her spirit wandered the palace corridors of Babylon, mourning the husband who had wedded her for an empire rather than for love. Her death became a legend, the first blood that was spilled in the disintegration of Alexander's dream. Roxana, who was now the mother of the king's only legitimate heir, Alexander IV, found herself surrounded by vultures. The generals who had once bowed to her husband now looked at her child as a pawn, a symbol to legitimize their own power grabs. She remained guarded, sharp, and ruthlessly aware that the world her husband had built was now turning against itself. In the east, the Persian nobles lamented the loss of the Achaemenid line. To them, Alexander's marriages had been a blasphemy, a Greek conqueror who was trying to wear their crown. In the west, the Macedonian veterans scoffed that their king had gone native, calling his Persian weddings the final proof of his corruption. The empire that he had married together was now divorcing itself along the very same cultural lines that he had tried so hard to erase. The ghosts of Susa were not just the abandoned wives or the murdered princesses. They were the dying echoes of Alexander's impossible dream. His attempt to unite hearts and empires had failed. What remained was grief, betrayal, and the slow unraveling of everything he had once held sacred. After Alexander's death, Roxana became both a queen and a prisoner, a woman who was trapped in the empire that her husband had built but could no longer hold together. Her only protection was the child that she carried, Alexander's son, the infant who would be known as Alexander IV. That child was her crown, her shield, and her curse. Every general in the fractured empire saw him as a tool, the key to legitimacy in a world that was now ruled by ambition and by steel. Roxana fled from Babylon under the protection of Perdiccas, who was Alexander's trusted lieutenant and who claimed to be guarding the royal family. But loyalty in this new world was as fragile as glass. The generals, Ptolemy in Egypt, Antigonus in Asia, and Cassander in Macedonia, were carving up the empire piece by piece. None of them feared Roxana. They feared the name that her child bore. The boy represented unity, something that none of them could allow to survive. Still, Roxana played her part shrewdly. She projected the image of a grieving widow, meek and loyal, while quietly maneuvering behind the scenes. She reminded those around her that her son was not just a prince. He was the living blood of Alexander the Great, born of both Macedonian and Persian lines. It was a story that she wielded like a weapon, invoking the memory of the man that no one dared to openly betray. But time was cruel. The world had no place for a child king or a queen without an army. Perdiccas was soon murdered, and with his death, Roxana lost her last true ally. She and her son were taken to Macedonia and placed under the protection of Cassander, a man whose smile concealed the patience of a serpent. For years, Roxana kept the boy hidden, teaching him tales of his father's greatness, whispering to him that one day he would reclaim his birthright. Yet deep down, she knew the truth. Alexander's empire was dead, and so was the dream that had once bound it all together. By the time her son had reached adolescence, Cassander no longer had any need for symbols. Quietly and efficiently, he ended the last chapter of Alexander's bloodline. Roxana and her son were executed in secret. The world moved on, and the widow who had once ruled over the greatest empire on earth vanished, leaving only a legend in her place. By the time that Roxana and her son had vanished from the world, Alexander's story had already begun to slip into legend. His empire had splintered, his generals had crowned themselves as kings, and the dream of a united world lay in ruins. Yet, amidst the smoke of forgotten cities, one truth endured, that no man had ever loved, ruled, or defied convention quite like Alexander had. His passions were as vast as his conquests, and his marriages revealed the soul of a man who was torn between love and legacy. The people of his empire told different stories depending on where they lived. To the Persians, Alexander was the foreign god king who had tried to blend their bloodlines with Macedonian steel. To the Greeks, he was the tragic genius who had lost himself to Eastern decadence. And to his soldiers, the men who had followed him through the deserts and across the Hindu Kush, he was something far stranger, a man who was too human to be a god, yet too godlike to be fully human. His loves, too, became a part of that mythology. Roxana, the wild beauty from the mountains, came to symbolize passion, love at first sight, fierce and doomed. Stateira, the daughter of Darius, represented diplomacy and empire, the marriage of the conqueror and the conquered. And somewhere in between stood Hephaestion, the soulmate, the mirror of Alexander's own restless heart. Together, they formed the trinity of his desire, the lover, the queen, and the companion, each of them embodying a different facet of who he was. The Macedonians, who had once mocked his Persian customs, later told tales of divine signs at his wedding, of omens that had foretold both his death and his glory. Poets in Alexandria compared him to Achilles and Patroclus, while Persian storytellers claimed that Roxana's child would one day return as a god reborn. Even centuries later, Roman emperors and medieval kings would look to Alexander's life for inspiration, and to his loves for a warning. For in the end, Alexander's marriages were more than just a scandal. They were a prophecy. They revealed the cost of having a vision, the price of uniting worlds that were never meant to merge. His empire perished, his wives died, and his son was silenced. But the legend of the man who loved too boldly, who ruled too widely, and who lived too fiercely would never die. In the centuries that followed his death, Alexander became more of a myth than a man. Historians chronicled his victories, poets praised his courage, and rulers across continents sought to claim his bloodline or his blessing. But the stories that lingered most vividly were not only about the cities that he had burned or the kingdoms that he had built. They were about the people who had loved him, and the ruin that those loves had left behind. The marriages that had once scandalized his court became symbols of his contradictions. Roxana, the wild bride of passion, was murdered in obscurity. Stateira, the royal bridge to Persia, was slain for her lineage. Hephaestion, his companion of the soul, was gone before him, leaving a void that no crown could ever fill. And Alexander himself, the man who thought he could unite love and empire, was buried in a tomb that no one can find. Together, their lives formed a tragedy that was as grand as any epic, not of conquest, but of the human heart. In trying to merge the East and the West, Alexander was trying to merge himself, the Greek hero and the Persian god, the lover and the conqueror, the mortal and the divine. But his marriages revealed that no man, not even one who had conquered the world, could ever conquer his own nature. His vision of unity had demanded that love serve politics, and that politics serve love, an impossible balance that left only blood and legend in its wake. His generals learned the lesson too late. The empires that they carved from his corpse lasted for mere decades before they devoured each other. The dream of a single world, born in a moment of ambition and sealed in the wedding halls of Susa, dissolved into centuries of war. What Alexander had joined together through desire, history tore apart through greed. And yet, perhaps that was always his fate. Men like Alexander were not meant to build peace. They were meant to burn so brightly that their ashes would light the ages. His loves were the mirrors of his empire, vast, beautiful, and doomed to collapse under their own weight. In the end, Alexander left behind no heirs, no peace, and no resting place. He left only a legacy of brilliance and the eternal whisper of the lovers who had followed him into history's shadow. The day in a Roman legionary camp began not with the first light of the sun, but with the sharp cry of the tuba, the Roman trumpet that cut through the morning air like a blade. Before the dawn, thousands of men would stir within the rows of their leather tents, each soldier wrapped in his cloak, his gear neatly stacked beside him. There was no such thing as sleeping in. The Roman army valued punctuality more than it did comfort. Within moments, an entire camp would awake as one, a machine of men and of discipline. The first task of the day was to dismantle the camp from the previous night. Every tent, every tool, and every weapon had its proper place. The legionaries moved with a mechanical precision, folding the leather tents, gathering the stakes, and packing the camp's portable altars. The fires were doused and the ashes were buried. Not even a single scrap of waste was ever left behind. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like chaos, but to Rome it was an art form, order that was forged from routine. Soon after came breakfast, which was usually cold bread, cheese, and water or a sour wine, eaten quickly and in silence. The officers would bark out their orders while the centurions paced the lines, checking to make sure that every man was properly equipped. The helmets gleamed, the sandals were strapped tight, and the shields rested against packs that could weigh nearly 30 kilograms. Each soldier carried his own kit, which included cooking tools, stakes for the palisades, rations, and his personal gear. Rome didn't rely on servants. The legionary was the army. Then came the march. The cornicen would blow another signal, and like clockwork, the legions would fall into formation. The standard bearers would raise the eagles high, and the column would begin to move. Thousands of iron-clad feet striking the earth in unison. The dust would rise, the birds would scatter, and the sound of the marching boots would roll across the land like thunder. They would walk for miles before they stopped, the empire's unstoppable tide, inching forward one measured step at a time. Yet before nightfall they would build it all again, a new fortress rising from the ground with the same precision as the last. Every camp, every trench, and every wall was a part of the rhythm of the empire. This was the secret of Rome's strength. Not just its swords, but its discipline. Even at dawn, when the rest of the world was still asleep, the legions were already at work, turning the wilderness into civilization, one trumpet call at a time. Once the last trumpet call had faded, the march would begin, not in chaos, but in a flawless precision. A Roman legion on the move was the most disciplined sight that the ancient world had ever seen. Tens of thousands of men, each of them carrying nearly half of their own body weight in armor and gear, would move in a tight formation along roads that had been carved by their own hands. The column would stretch on for miles, but every single step, every pause, and every command followed the same rhythm, as if the entire army was sharing a single heartbeat. The order of the march was sacred. The scouts would ride ahead to secure the route, followed by the engineers and the surveyors who would measure the distances and mark where the next camp was to be built. Behind them came the vexillarii, the standard bearers, who carried the banners that identified each unit. Then came the legionaries marching shoulder to shoulder, their shields strapped to their backs and their armor clinking in unison. The sound was hypnotic, iron, dust, and determination. Each man carried his entire world with him. His sarsana, the marching pack, contained his tools, his rations, spare sandals, stakes for the palisades, a cooking pot, and a few personal tokens. The soldiers called themselves Muli Mariani, which means Marius's mules, after the general who had once reformed the legions to carry their own burdens. They would grumble about it, but they carried on. Complaining was allowed, but stopping was not. The centurions would march at the edges of the column, their vine staffs at the ready to strike at anyone who broke the formation. Discipline was absolute. If a soldier were to drop out without permission, he risked being given lashes or worse. The Romans believed that a combination of fear and pride was what kept men in line, and both were present in abundance. The heat of the day would bring exhaustion, the dust would stick to their sweat, and the armor would bite into their shoulders. Yet the legions marched on relentlessly, often covering 20 miles before noon. To them, hardship was just a part of the routine, and comfort was a weakness. Even the generals, including Caesar himself, would often walk beside their men, showing that the greatness of Rome was built not by nobles, but by endurance. When the day's journey finally came to an end, no rest awaited them. The second trumpet would soon sound, the signal that marked the next stage of their endless ritual. For the Roman soldiers, the march was never truly over. Each day ended where the next fortress began. As the day's march drew to a close, the legions would halt at the signal of the trumpet. But their work was far from over. The moment a suitable spot was chosen, ideally a flat area that was near a source of water and away from any potential ambush points, the Roman army would transform from a marching column into an army of engineers. Every single evening, they would build an entire fortified camp from scratch. The Praefectus Castrorum, the camp prefect, and his surveyors would begin the process. Using wooden staffs, measuring cords, and a device called a groma, they would lay out the precise dimensions of the camp. Every camp followed the exact same pattern, regardless of the terrain or the distance they had marched that day. The Romans could take a patch of wilderness and turn it into a miniature city in less than a few hours. The legionaries would drop their heavy packs, pick up their shovels, axes, and pickaxes, and then they would begin to dig. The ditches were carved in perfect rectangles, usually about 2 meters deep, surrounding the camp like a moat. The earth that was dug from the trenches was then piled inward to form a rampart, which was the foundation of the vallum, or the defensive wall. Wooden stakes were then driven into it to create a palisade, as sharp as spears, ready to repel any attackers. Every man had his duty. The engineers would oversee the construction, the legionaries would dig and hammer, and the centurions would roam the site like hawks, ensuring that the walls were straight and that the work was relentless. Even though they were exhausted from the day's march, no soldier ever dared to slack off. Discipline was survival. A careless hand could doom thousands if an enemy were to strike in the night. Inside the walls, order ruled. The streets were marked out in perfect right angles, with the main road, the Via Principalis, dividing the camp. The general's tent stood at the center, surrounded by the headquarters, the armories, and the granaries. Each cohort had its own designated space, and every tent was lined up as neatly as a row of tiles. When the final stake was hammered in and the trench was completed, the tuba would sound again. The men would exhale, not in rest but in readiness. The fires were lit, the guards were posted, and the sentries took their stations. From above, a Roman camp would glow like a pattern of stars, a geometry that was forged in discipline and in iron. Every night they would build safety with their own hands, and every dawn they would tear it all down again. As twilight settled in, the newly built fortress would pulse with order and with routine. Within the freshly dug walls of the camp, there was no confusion, only purpose. Every street, every tent, and every pathway had a meaning, all of it laid out with a mathematical precision. The Romans did not merely camp. They constructed civilization wherever it was that they stopped. At the very center of it all stood the Praetorium, the commander's tent. It was larger than any of the others, and it was marked by standards that would flutter in the evening breeze. Here, the general would plan the next day's march. He would issue his orders, and he would dine, surrounded by his officers. The maps were spread out across wooden tables. The candles would flicker against the bronze armor, and the decisions that would shape entire empires were made over bread and wine. Around the Praetorium lay the administrative heart of the camp, the Principia, where the records were kept, the pay was distributed, and the messages were received. It also served as a shrine for the legion's standards, the sacred emblems that the soldiers had sworn to defend with their very lives. Losing a standard was considered to be worse than death, and regaining one could redeem an entire legion's honor. To one side stood the Quaestorium, a guarded area that held the army's supplies, food, weapons, siege tools, and the treasury. Every single item was counted, sealed, and recorded. The Romans understood that war was not won by swords alone, but by logistics. Grain and discipline were just as vital as courage and steel. Further out, rows of leather tents filled the camp, perfectly aligned like the streets of a city. Each contubernium, a group of 8 soldiers, shared one tent and a small cooking area. Here the men would joke, they would argue, and they would mend their gear. The smell of wood smoke and boiled lentils would drift through the air. Laughter would mix with the clang of armor being repaired and the rhythmic scrape of whetstones on blades. The evening meals were humble: barley porridge, cheese, dried meat, and watered-down wine. Yet for men who had marched for miles and had dug for hours, it was a feast. The centurions would walk the lines, ensuring discipline, while the engineers would check the fortifications. Every sound had an order, and every task had a reason. As the night deepened, the torches would burn in even intervals, casting long shadows across the camp streets. The Praetorium would glow faintly at its heart, a reminder that this was not just a resting place, but a living fortress, beating in a perfect Roman rhythm. As the camp settled into the evening, the daily rhythm of a Roman legionary continued. one that was built on order, on repetition, and on endurance. There was no such thing as leisure, only the illusion of rest. Every action, even the simplest one, had its place within the structure of military discipline. After constructing the fortifications, the soldiers would then turn to maintenance. The armor had to be polished, the weapons had to be sharpened, and the shields had to be inspected for any cracks. Neglect was not tolerated. Rust and dull edges could mean death in battle. The camp would ring with the rasp of whetstones, the creak of leather being repaired, and the quiet murmur of men who were speaking Latin, Greek, or their native dialects, 1,000 different tongues that were all bound by the same iron code. Dinner would come next. Each contubernium, a group of 8 men, would gather around their small fire to cook a shared meal. The food was simple: barley porridge, beans, cheese, and sometimes a piece of salted pork. It wasn't much, but it was consistent, and in the Roman army, consistency meant survival. The soldiers carried their own cooking tools, their own grain, and even their own mills. A Roman legion was completely self-sufficient, a mobile city that fed, armed, and maintained itself without ever having to depend on local supplies. Once they had eaten, the men would clean their area meticulously. The waste was buried, the tools were neatly arranged, and the fires were extinguished, except for those that were kept for watch duties. Order was sacred, and an untidy camp was a punishable offense. The centurions would make their rounds, inspecting the tents and checking their lists. They were the backbone of the army, hard men who enforced the will of Rome with both courage and with cruelty. As dusk deepened, the tuba would sound again, the signal for the evening watch. The guards would take their positions along the ramparts and the gates, their torches flickering against the new walls that they had built only hours before. Beyond the camp's perimeter stretched the wilderness, the forests, the hills, or the barren plains that were filled with the unknown. Inside, everything was under control. Outside, chaos waited. Before they went to sleep, prayers were offered. Some soldiers would whisper to Mars for strength, while others would pray to the household gods that were far from their homes. Then came the silence, a heavy, disciplined stillness that was broken only by the footsteps of the sentries and the distant hoot of the owls. For the legionary, peace was not the absence of war. It was the brief calm that came between the trumpet calls. As the darkness blanketed the camp, the illusion of rest gave way to vigilance. The Romans never slept carelessly. They understood that danger did not simply vanish with the daylight. Each night, a strict order governed who would watch, who would sleep, and who would be held accountable for any failures. The Vigiliae Nocturnae, or the night watches, divided the hours between sunset and dawn into 4 separate shifts. Every soldier knew when he was scheduled to be on guard, and every centurion knew that a single mistake could destroy them all. At the start of the first watch, the tribune and the senior centurions would inspect the sentries who were stationed along the vallum, the earthen wall that was crowned with wooden stakes. The torches would flicker across the perimeter, their glow bouncing off of the iron helmets. The sentries stood at regular intervals, peering out into the night beyond the trench. They carried spears and wore their armor even while they were on guard, for an attack could come at any moment. It could be a raiding party, a band of thieves, or worse, a stealthy enemy who was just waiting for sleep to dull the Roman edge. Each guard shift lasted for roughly 3 hours, and it was marked by the rhythmic sound of the bucina, the curved horn that signaled the change of the watch. When one guard's duty had ended, another would replace him seamlessly. No shift was ever left empty, and no gate was ever left unwatched. If a soldier was ever caught sleeping on duty, the punishment was swift and brutal, often death by stoning or a beating at the hands of his own comrades. Discipline in the legions was not mere obedience, it was survival. The fear of dishonor ran deeper than the fear of pain. To let down one's cohort was to invite the scorn of every man who had trusted his life to your vigilance. Inside the camp, the rest of the soldiers would lie in their tents, sleeping lightly beneath their cloaks, their shields stacked by the entrance, ready at a moment's notice. Even in their slumber, a Roman legion was a weapon that was poised to strike. Occasionally, the officers would make silent rounds to ensure that order was being maintained. A single shout of ad signa, which meant to arms, could rouse the entire camp in a matter of minutes. Outside the palisade, the world was silent. There was the faint rustle of the wind through the trees, the crackle of the torches, and the metallic breath of the soldiers who were standing watch. Within that disciplined darkness, Rome's true strength revealed itself, not in conquest but in control. Before the dawn, the camp would stir once again to the sound of the tuba. To the legionary, morning meant movement, and movement meant dismantling everything that he had built the night before. Rest was only temporary. Permanence belonged only to Rome itself. Within minutes, thousands of men were awake, rolling up their cloaks, stamping out the dying embers, and collapsing their tents with a practiced efficiency. Every tent and every stake had its exact place, and each man knew his part. There were 8 soldiers to a tent, and each one was responsible for one section of the contubernium. Some would fold the leather coverings, while others would pack the wooden poles or gather the cooking tools. Nothing was ever left behind, not even the ashes from the fires of the night before. The Romans prided themselves on leaving no trace of their presence, except for the straight line of a road and the echo of their discipline. As the sky began to lighten, the quaestors would oversee the packing of the supplies. The food rations, the siege equipment, and the portable altars that were used for the daily sacrifices. The camp prefect would check the walls one last time before giving the signal to strike them down. In less than an hour, the fortress that had guarded 10,000 men would vanish, its walls reduced to piles of earth, its gates taken apart plank by plank. The legions would form up once more, their armor gleaming with the dew, their shields strapped to their backs, and their tools hanging from their belts. Every soldier's pack weighed nearly 30 kilograms, a burden that was carried without any complaint. The centurions would inspect their ranks, ensuring that not a single helmet, strap, or sandal was out of order. Perfection wasn't about vanity, it was about survival. Before they marched, the augur would perform a short ritual, reading the omens in the flight of the birds or the shape of the smoke from the morning fires. The soldiers would watch in silence. To defy an omen was to risk disaster, and to follow it was to honor the gods of war. Only when the priest had nodded did the trumpet sound again. And then, with the rising sun glinting off of the bronze and the iron, the column would begin to move. The dust would rise from the earth as the legions left behind another invisible city. a fortress that had existed for only one night. For the Roman soldier, the pattern never changed: build, rest, dismantle, and march. Their days were an endless repetition, and their purpose was eternal. Once the camp had been dismantled, the army would begin its daily pilgrimage through the empire, a moving city of discipline, of sweat, and of iron. The morning air was sharp, filled with the sounds of clinking armor and the rhythmic thud of sandals on the packed earth. The legions would march in a perfect formation, with each man keeping pace to the beat of the cornison's horn. To watch them move was to see order that had been made flesh, an army so precise that even nature itself seemed to step aside for them. At the front would ride the scouts and the engineers, clearing away any obstacles and marking the route. Behind them would come the standard bearers, holding the sacred eagles high. Each banner would flutter with pride, the embodiment of Rome's very soul. The legionaries would follow, divided by their cohorts, their red cloaks swaying in the wind. Every few miles the trumpets would blare, signaling them to rest, to adjust their formation, or to resume the march. The Roman army didn't just wander. It measured the world in its footsteps. Every man carried not only his weapons, but civilization itself. The roads were carved as they advanced, the ditches were filled, and bridges were built where none had existed before. To follow a Roman legion was to follow progress, for in their wake would come trade, law, and the Latin tongue. The villages would tremble as they passed, not just from fear, but from a sense of awe. Rome's power was not in its brutality alone, but in the precision of her soldiers, who could fight like wolves and build like gods. The pace was relentless. A full day's march could cover up to 20 miles beneath the sun, with the armor heating up like an oven. The dust would cling to their sweat, and every breath would taste of metal and of earth. Yet the men never faltered. The centurions would bark out their commands, striking any laggards with their vine staffs. To fall behind was a humiliation. To endure was an honor. Occasionally, the column would have to cross rivers, and their engineers would throw up bridges made from timber and rope in a matter of hours. Even the smallest of delays was unacceptable. The armies of Rome did not wait, they made the world move for them. By the late afternoon, the horizon would shimmer with the heat. The men's shadows would grow long and fatigue would begin to set in. But the order never broke. The tuba would soon sound again, not for them to rest, but for them to build. For wherever it was that they stopped, Rome would rise anew from the dust, one fortress at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Roman legions would prepare for the cycle to begin all over again. The day may have ended, but the machine of the empire did not rest. When the order came to halt, the engineers would ride ahead to mark the next camp's perimeter, driving stakes into the ground and planting flags to designate where each cohort would stand. Behind them, the soldiers would arrive in waves, weary, sweating, and silent, and once more, they would begin their nightly ritual of creation. The land itself would bend to the Roman design. The trenches were dug, the ramparts were raised, and the palisades were hammered together in a rhythmic unity. The fires would flicker along the perimeter, their glow spreading across the plain like molten gold. The legionaries worked swiftly, almost mechanically. They had done this so many times that even their exhaustion could not slow them down. It was muscle memory, a civilization's heartbeat that was echoing through the hands of its men. By nightfall, the new fortress was complete, perfectly measured, fortified, and alive. The officers would dine near the Praetorium, eating from bronze plates and discussing their maps under the lamplight. The rank and file would gather by their fires, joking, gambling with dice, or telling stories of their homes, of their farms in Latium, their wives in Campania, or the taste of the wine from Gaul. Yet even in these brief moments of warmth, discipline never slept. The guards would rotate through their shifts, the scouts would slip beyond the walls to monitor the dark, and the centurions would pace the lines, their eyes as sharp as blades. From a distance, the camp would look like a star that had fallen to earth, a square of light, geometric and unyielding, surrounded by blackness. Every fortress, every trench, and every footprint that was carved into the soil was a statement that Rome could impose its order anywhere. The wilderness became a grid work, and the night became the day. When the morning came, the trumpets would sound again. The walls would fall, the camp would vanish, and the army would move on, leaving behind nothing but the faint imprint of perfection. For the Roman legionary, life was an endless march between creation and destruction, between chaos and command. This was how Rome conquered the world, not merely through war but through habit, through the rhythm of men who built a fortress each night, tore it down each dawn, and called it peace. The empire slept in no bed because Rome itself never slept.